Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the cool shadow of a marble colonnade in a city where the Aegean wind carried both salt and the faint scent of olive presses, there once stood a tall slab of stone. It was not unusual to see such stelae in the public spaces of ancient Greece. They were the city's memory made tangible, a record for all who passed to read. Merchants, sailors, visiting dignitaries, and barefoot children could look upon them, and, if they were literate, trace their fingers over names that connected the present to the past. This particular stone had been set up at the edge of a processional road leading to the sanctuary of a local goddess, perhaps Artemis, perhaps Demeter. Its lettering was cut deep and precise, as if the mason had taken particular pride in his work. The inscription did not list victorious generals or decrees passed in the assembly. Instead, it named women, line after line, name after name, each accompanied by the briefest of notes, a village of origin, a father's name, sometimes a contribution for the woven mantle, for the golden pans, for the lamp oil at the feast. For modern eyes, accustomed to the absence of women's names in the political records of ancient Greece, this would have been remarkable. Here were women publicly acknowledged, their existence and their actions fixed in stone. These were not mythical heroines or queens from epic tales, but living women of the polis, some wealthy, some perhaps modest in means, who had contributed to the great annual festival honoring the goddess. The festival itself had roots deeper than memory. Each year, the city prepared months in advance. Looms clicked in courtyards as women worked together to weave the sacred mantle, the peplos that would be presented to the goddess. The temple precinct was cleaned, whitewashed, and adorned. The air filled with the sounds of rehearsals, the measured steps of the procession, the rhythmic chants of the hymns, the clatter of ceremonial vessels. The women whose names appeared on the stone had not been silent participants. They had funded, organized, and in some cases led the rituals. The peplos could not be woven without wool, dyes, and the labor of skilled weavers. The lamps that burned through the night in the temple's inner court needed oil, costly in a land where olive trees took years to bear fruit. The musicians and dancers who performed in the goddess's honor needed to be clothed and fed. These women, by providing funds, goods, or service, ensured that the festival retained its splendor for the city. The public recording of these names was both a gesture of thanks and a model of civic piety. The stone was a statement. Here were women who had upheld the traditions, who had honored the goddess, who had strengthened the bonds of the community through their contributions. It was also, in its way, an assertion of identity in a world where memory was as fragile as papyrus. To be inscribed in stone was to resist forgetting, and so the slab stood, season after season. Passers-by might pause to read, perhaps recognizing a mother, sister, or neighbor. Children might run their fingers along the grooves of the letters, learning the shapes that spelled the names of people they knew. It was a shared heritage, open to all eyes, but stone, for all its hardness, is not eternal in meaning. Centuries, or even decades, can transform how a name is read, or whether it is read at all. We do not know the exact moment when the decision was made. It may have been in the wake of a political change, a coup, a war, or a shift in the dominant faction. It may have been tied to a religious reform, a change in the city's patron deity, or the suppression of a particular cult. Or it may have been something smaller, something pettier, a moralistic decree that women should not be so prominently recorded in public space. What we do know comes from the scars. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find the slab, toppled and broken into several pieces, buried beneath layers of soil and pottery fragments. The stone had been reused as building material, perhaps in a wall, perhaps as paving. Survival was accidental. When the dirt was brushed away, the letters emerged, still sharp in some places, worn in others. But the most striking feature was the damage, a long, deliberate scraping over each and every woman's name. Not a haphazard act of vandalism, but careful work with a chisel, striking again and again until the characters were no longer legible. The fathers' names remained. The notes about contributions remained, but the women themselves had been erased too. Stand before such a stone in a museum today is to feel the weight of absence. The missing names are not simply blank spaces. They are voids with edges. The stone still remembers that there were names there. The lines of the inscription are uneven now, interrupted where the chisel bit deepest. If you look closely, you can sometimes see the ghost of a letter, the curve of an omicron, the twin uprights of an eta, but never enough to reconstruct the full name. Why? The question presses itself forward. Was it an attempt to obscure their role in the festival, to deny that women had ever been publicly honored in such a way? Was it an act of personal revenge against specific families? Or was it part of a broader cultural shift, a tightening of the rules about who could be commemorated in public inscriptions? Historians offer different theories. In some Greek Peleus, shifts in citizenship law excluded certain categories of women from recognition, foreign-born wives, for example, or daughters of non-citizens. If such a law was applied retroactively, it might have led to the erasure of names that no longer fit the official definition of a citizen woman. In other cases, religious reforms sought to centralize worship under a state-controlled priesthood, stripping away honors from those associated with rival cults. But there is another layer, more intangible. Public inscriptions were about memory, but they were also about visibility. By erasing these names, whoever ordered the act ensured that future generations would not casually encounter them in the public square. The women's contributions would fade from common knowledge, their presence in civic life reduced to silence. This was not a small thing in a society where memory was often oral, and where the written word was a tool for shaping collective identity. The slab, once a testament to women's agency in the religious life of the city, was transformed into a quieter, more ambiguous object, a list of contributions with the identities removed. And yet, stone was never destroyed entirely. This is a curious fact. In other instances of political or religious purges, inscriptions might be smashed to rubble, their fragments scattered. Here, the stone was preserved enough to be reused whole. Perhaps the masons valued its quality, the fine marble worth too much to waste. Or perhaps the order had been to erase the names, not the act of commemoration itself. The city still wanted to remember that offerings had been given, just not by these women. For the modern observer, this choice leaves a trail of paradoxes. The erasure was meant to silence, but it also preserved the shape of what was lost. The act of scraping left marks that speak as loudly as the letters once did. We cannot know the women's names, but we can know that they were there, and that someone, at some point, felt it necessary to remove them. It is here, in the tension between presence and absence, that the story of the Festival of the Forgotten Daughters begins. In the next part, we will follow the faint traces in surviving records, the patterns of other inscriptions, to see if we can glimpse the women whose names were once spoken aloud in the sunlit square, and whose memory someone worked so hard to erase. The slab, with its deep and deliberate gouges, stands as one of the most haunting examples of selective memory in the ancient world. But to understand why a city would take the trouble to chisel away 200 women's names line after careful line, we have to step back into the political and cultural landscape that shaped such an act. Ancient Greek city-states were not monolithic in their laws or customs. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each had its own rhythms, its own rules about citizenship, religion, and public honor. Even within a single polis, those rules could change dramatically depending on which faction held power. By the time the inscription we now call the Festival of the Forgotten Daughters was carved, Greece was in a period of shifting political identities. In some cities, oligarchic councils, small groups of elite families, were reasserting control after periods of more open participation. In others, democratic assemblies were reshaping the laws in ways that tightened the definition of citizenship. These changes were not always bloody coups. Often, they were enacted quietly, but through decrees and procedural reforms that changed who counted as part of the civic body. One of the most consequential shifts in several Greek cities was the narrowing of who could be recognized as a citizen. In Athens, for instance, the Periclean citizenship law of 451 BCE restricted citizenship to those with two citizen parents. Before that, a man could be considered a citizen even if his mother was a foreigner. After the reform, such unions produced children who were legally excluded from the citizen body. Similar patterns occurred elsewhere. This had direct implications for women, because in a system where lineage and legitimacy were carefully policed, their parentage determined the civic status of their children and their own right to participate in certain public rights. If the women on the stone had included foreigners, medics, resident non-citizens, or the daughters of men who had married outside the citizen class, they could be retroactively disqualified from public honor. Schism, in this sense, was enforcing a new definition of belonging, but laws alone rarely drive such erasures. Behind the formal language of decrees, there were always people, leaders with agendas, rival families, and entrenched factions using the tools of law to shape the city's story. Public inscriptions were one of the most visible ways to broadcast that story. They stood in sanctuaries, marketplaces, and along roads where citizens gathered. Were, in effect, the ancient equivalent of a public bulletin board, combined with a monument, a constant reminder of who had mattered in the city's life. In the case of the festival inscription, the act of erasing was surgical. The chisel left the structure of the text intact: the fathers' names, the nature of the offerings, the order of listing. This suggests that the city still wanted to keep a record of the festival's grandeur and its funding, but it no longer wanted was for these particular women to be publicly remembered as the ones who had made it possible to modern ears. This might sound like a minor slight, an absence on a list, but in the ancient world, where literacy was limited and public honor was a rare avenue for women to be recognized outside the household, this was more than insult. It was a civic death. To be removed from the record was to be told, retroactively, that you had not counted. The work of removal was itself a public performance. Chiseling names from marble was not a silent, invisible act. It took time, effort, and skill, the same skills that had once carved the letters T. The mason would have worked in the open air, hammer ringing against chisel, the sound carrying across the sanctuary courtyard or the marketplace. Passersby would have seen the work in progress, perhaps even known the names being erased. Erasure was not only about the future, it was also a message to the present. Why, then, target women? One explanation lies in the uneasy relationship between women's public religious roles and the male-dominated political sphere. In many Greek cities, women played central parts in festivals, especially those honoring goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Demeter. They could serve as priestesses, led processions, and fund offerings. These roles, though religious, were also public displays of influence. A wealthy woman who funded a costly festival contribution was making a statement about her family's prominence. Her name on a stone was a political signal as much as a pious one. If a faction came to power that sought to diminish a rival family's standing, targeting such inscriptions was an efficient way to do it. Removing the women's names didn't just erase individuals, it weakened the public memory of the family networks behind them. Religious reform is another plausible motive. Ancient Greek religion was not a static system. It evolved with politics. Sometimes, older festivals fell out of favor, replaced by new ones that aligned better with the state's priorities. If the festival of the Forgotten Daughters had been tied to a cult or a local goddess whose influence waned, later officials might have decided to neutralize its old records. By erasing the women's names, they could strip the past ritual of its personal associations, leaving behind only the shell of a civic tradition. There's also the possibility of moral censure. In periods of economic strain or social unrest, public discourse in some palaces turned sharply toward austerity and discipline. Lavish displays, even in religious contexts, could be condemned as decadent. Women were seen as symbols of such extravagance. Their names could become politically toxic. Erasing them from the stone would signal a return to proper values, at least in the eyes of those in power. What's striking is how methodical the erasure was. The chisel marks are clean, straight, and consistent. This was not done in haste, nor was it an act of angry vandalism under cover of darkness. It was sanctioned, planned, and carried out by someone with both access to the stone and the authority to alter it. This, too, fits a broader pattern in the ancient world. Damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, was a tool of statecraft. It could target emperors, generals, or anyone whose continued presence in the public record was considered undesirable. The stone's survival into modern times owes itself to the ancient habit of reusing building materials. At some point, long after the names had been erased, the slab was removed from its original setting and incorporated into a wall or a floor. Its original significance was forgotten. It became just another piece of marble. This accidental preservation allowed archaeologists to recover it centuries later. When the slab was uncovered, scholars noticed something intriguing. While the women's names were gone, the physical space where each name had been was still visible. The gouges were shallower in some places, deeper in others, as though the mason had been working to obscure different lengths of text. By measuring these gaps, researchers could estimate how long the names had been. Some were short, perhaps Eris or Cleo, others much longer, suggesting compound names or epithets. This method doesn't restore the names, but it gives a shadow of their diversity. And then there is the question of the number 200. This was not a casual list. It represented a significant portion of the city's female elite, or at least those connected to the festival. Each woman had family ties to one or more citizen households. The network erased here could encompass much of the polis' influential families. To remove them en masse was a statement of sweeping change, not just isolated punishment. For us, the erasure is frustrating because it deprives us of the individual human stories. The woman who saved for years to fund a lamp oil offering, the weaver whose intricate patterns adorned the papyrus, the priestess who led the hymns at dawn. But the erasure also speaks. It tells us that their contributions were once visible enough to be threatening, significant enough to be deliberately removed. Even in the absence of their names, the slab has become a kind of reverse monument. Instead of commemorating the honored, it commemorates the act of forgetting. Each scar where a name once was is a reminder that history is not only about what is remembered, but also about what and who is intentionally erased in the final section of this story. We will follow how this practice of selective memory in inscriptions parallels other examples across the Greek world, and how modern archaeology and epigraphy attempt to restore, at least in part, the identities of those who were once struck from stone. We will see how, despite the chisel's work, traces of these women still surface in stray inscriptions, in temple inventories, in the margins of history, Inscriptions of history. The stone stands mute, its surface an uneven pattern of letters and scars. It's the casual passerby in the sanctuary courtyard. Whether in antiquity or now, it might look like nothing more than a damaged dedication. But for those who know what to look for, it is an archive of two histories, the one the city wanted remembered and the one it wanted erased. What happened to the women after their names were carved away? The truth is that the stone will never tell us. The physical act of removal does not explain the fates of individuals. Some of them may have lived on comfortably in their homes, their influence intact within their families. Others may have felt the quiet humiliation of walking past a festival square, knowing their public honor had been stripped away. Still others may have died before the chisel ever struck. The removal aimed not at them personally, but at the family names they represented. What is certain is that the erasure left a ripple in the civic memory. Public inscriptions were more than records. They were part of the city's visual and ritual landscape. For a woman to see her name carved in marble was rare. Most women in the Greek world left no inscribed legacy at all. That rarity made the removal all the more severe when modern archaeologists first uncovered the slab. The marks of erasure were still crisp in places, as though the stonecutter's hand had been there only recently. The Greeks used a system of deeply incised letters in official inscriptions, often painted with red or black pigment to make them stand out. Over time, the pigment wore away, but the cut letters endured. Erasing them meant cutting deeper, flattening the surface until the original strokes vanished. Even then, under certain light, ghostly outlines sometimes remained faint, like shadows at the bottom of a shallow pool. In recent years, scholars have turned to advanced imaging techniques to coax these ghosts into view. One such method, reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, uses multiple light sources and digital processing to reveal surface variations invisible to the naked eye. Under RTI, some of the erased areas on the slab revealed tiny remnants of strokes, a slanted line here, a half circle there. It was enough, in a few cases, to tentatively reconstruct parts of names. One incomplete name began with the letters PHA, perhaps Fanese, 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 or Fanese. Another ended in Kratis, a common element in women's names of the time. None of these reconstructions is definitive, but they show that even when memory is deliberately attacked, it is rarely destroyed completely. The physical stubbornness of stone resists total silence. From these faint traces, epigraphers began to build hypotheses. Were these women connected by kinship, by their roles in the festival, by political alignment? The surviving part of the inscription still listed the festival's offerings: wool for sacred garments, barley for sacrificial cakes, oil for the lamps. These were standard elements in many Greek festivals, but the scale suggested wealth. The amounts were not for a small, local rite. They were for a citywide event, perhaps even one drawing visitors from neighboring palaes. If so, the women's contributions would have been highly visible, a display of piety and generosity before a broad audience. Such visibility could easily become a political liability if the winds of power shifted. One theory is that the erasure followed a coup or a radical reform in the citizen roles, where the new regime sought to purify the record by removing those deemed unqualified or politically suspect. There are parallels elsewhere in the Greek world. In the island city of Thasos, an inscription recording dedications by women in the early 4th century BCE shows similar chisel marks where names were later removed. In that case, scholars suspected change in the city's citizenship laws that excluded women of mixed parentage. In Athens, there are decrees from the same period that specifically forbid the naming of certain women in public records, a sign that the practice of erasure was part of a broader toolkit for controlling civic memory. The festival of the Forgotten Daughter slab fits into this wider pattern. It is part of what historians call curated forgetting, the deliberate shaping of the past through selective preservation. This was not simple vandalism or neglect. It was an official decision to redefine the story the city told about itself. What makes this case unique is the scale. 200 names suggest that the erasure was not a petty feud against a handful of families, but a systematic purge of a large, possibly influential segment of society. It may have been a symbolic act as much as a practical one. By striking out these women, the city could demonstrate its commitment to a new order, to a vision of itself that excluded certain lineages. The emotional impact on the community must have been complex. For the families of the erased women, there was the sting of seeing their relatives disappear from the stone. For others, perhaps, there was satisfaction, the sense that justice, as they defined it, had been done. Still others may have felt unease, wondering whose names might be next. Public inscriptions were meant to be permanent. To see one altered so drastically would remind everyone that permanence was an illusion, dependent on the will of those in power. From a modern perspective, the stone is a paradox. It is both an instrument of erasure and a record of that erasure. Without it, we might never know that these women had been honored at all. The scars are themselves a kind of testimony, a physical acknowledgement that something and someone once occupied this space in the city's memory. The archaeological context adds another layer to the story. The slab was found reused in the foundations of a later building, its inscribed face turned inward. This suggests that, at some point, even the altered version of the record was deemed expendable. Once it had served its purpose as a public statement, it could be discarded, its original function forgotten. Only by chance did it survive to be read again in studying such artifacts. Historians are often caught between the desire to restore the lost names and the recognition that their absence is part of the artifact's meaning. To fill in every gap would be to undo the work of the chisel, to reverse a deliberate historical act. Yet the impulse to recover what was taken is strong. Each reconstructed name is a small act of resistance against the forces that try to erase it. In some ways, the Festival of the Forgotten Daughters is less about the women themselves, whose lives remain largely unknown, and more about the mechanisms of memory in the ancient world. It forces us to confront the fact that history is not a neutral record, but a landscape continually reshaped by those who have the means to write and rewrite its markers. The irony is that in trying to erase these women, the city inadvertently made them more intriguing to future generations. Had their names remained, the slab might have been just another festival list among thousands. By removing them, the city created a puzzle, one that has drawn centuries of curiosity, scholarship, and speculation. And perhaps, in that way, the women have won a strange kind of immortality. Their names may be gone, but the act of erasure has made them unforgettable. They are the absent presences in every photograph of the slab, the silent figures behind every scholarly paper about its meaning. They are, paradoxically, remembered precisely because someone tried so hard to forget them in the larger context of ancient Greek history. This story reminds us that memory was always contested. Stones could be carved, but they could also be recut. Stories could be told, but they could also be retold, reshaped, or silenced. The chisel was as much a political tool as the spear or the coin, and every mark it made, whether to create or to destroy, was a choice about what the future should see. Today, the slab rests in a museum case, its erasures lit carefully so visitors can see the scars. Children press their hands to the glass, tracing the invisible names. Scholars lean close with magnifying lenses. And somewhere in the silence of the marble, the festival still lingers, not as it was, but as the city decided it should be. The daughters are forgotten in one sense, but in another, They are everywhere, in the careful scratches, in the stubborn surface that refuses to give up all its secrets, in the very fact that we keep asking who they were, who they were. The fragment was not impressive at first glance. It lay half buried in the soil near the outer boundary of an ancient sanctuary, where centuries of rain had washed soil down from the hillside above. To the archaeologists working there in the late summer heat, it was just another piece of marble among the hundreds of broken architectural elements and worn paving stones they had been uncovering for weeks. It was only when the dirt was brushed away and the sun caught the incised lines on its face that its strangeness began to emerge. The block was rectangular, about the height of a human thigh, and the letters carved into it were large, meant to be read from a distance. They were in the clean, angular style used in the late 5th century BCE, each stroke cut deep and precise. The spacing between the lines suggested that this was an official inscription, perhaps a decree, a dedication, or a list of offerings. But what drew immediate attention was the fact that most of the lines were not lines at all anymore. They were long, shallow troughs where the original letters had been carefully ground away. Only the first few lines were intact. They named the sanctuary of Artemis in the city of Orchomenus in the rugged region of Boeotia, and recorded that a certain woman, described as Hierea, or high priestess, had presided over the consecration of new sacred vessels. Her name appeared in the second line, still, crisp, and sharp: Timoclea, daughter of Polycrates. And then, below her name, came this strange absence. Whatever else had been written there, perhaps a record of the festival she had overseen, the dedications she had received on the goddess's behalf, or the names of other women who had served with her, was gone. Not broken, not worn away by time, but deliberately erased. The chisel marks were methodical, the work of a craftsman tasked with obliterating, not vandalizing, for the epigraphers who studied the fragment. This was a familiar but still unsettling sight. Name erasure in Greek inscriptions was not rare, but it usually occurred in political contexts: the removal of a disgraced official's name from a decree, or the suppression of a treaty partner who had become an enemy. But here, the focus seemed to be on a woman who held a religious office. That alone raised questions. To understand why such an erasure might happen, we have to step into the world of Greek religion in the classical period, a world where civic life, politics, and the sacred were deeply intertwined. In most Greek cities, the priesthoods of major gods and goddesses were not merely spiritual roles. They were prestigious public offices. A high priestess of Artemis could be as politically influential in her city as a magistrate or general. She would preside over processions, handle offerings worth large sums of silver, and represent the city's piety to outsiders. In Boeotia, Artemis was not just a huntress goddess, she was a guardian of the city's prosperity and its young women. Festivals in her honor often doubled as displays of civic unity, with maidens dancing in choruses, carrying baskets of barley, or weaving ceremonial garments. The high priestess stood at the center of these rites. Her reputation was tarnished. The city's religious prestige could suffer. The case of Timoclea is particularly intriguing because her name was not erased. Only the rest of the inscription was. Why preserve her identity while destroying the record of her actions? One possibility is that she was not the target at all. Perhaps the erasure was aimed at the other women named on the stone, assistants, donors, or dancers in the festival. By keeping Timoclea's name, the stone still marked her as a legitimate priestess. But by removing the others, the city could rewrite the collective memory of who had participated. Another possibility is that the erased text contained something politically dangerous. Inscriptions sometimes recorded the origins of dedications, naming the donors and their home cities. Those donors later became enemies of Orchomenus. Their names might be removed to avoid honoring foreigners or political adversaries. In such a scenario, Timoclea's name could remain as a safe emblem of local piety, while the foreign connections were quietly eliminated. Yet, there is also a third, more personal possibility: factional rivalry within the city itself. Priesthoods in the Greek world could be hereditary, rotating between a small number of elite families. If one family fell from power, their rivals might seek to diminish their influence by altering the public record. An inscription celebrating a rival's festival would be a tempting target. Erasing parts of it would not only diminish their glory, but also subtly cast doubt on their legitimacy. Whatever the motive, the erasure was carried out with skill. The removed letters were ground so flat that, under normal daylight, the surface looked like plain marble. Only under grazing light could the faintest traces be seen. A hooked line here, a shallow curve there. Modern imaging has allowed scholars to reconstruct small fragments of the lost text, but no more than a handful of partial words. The fragment's location adds another layer of mystery. It was found not in the main sanctuary complex, but on its periphery, near a secondary entrance that may have led to a processional route. This suggests that it once stood where festival participants would pass by a public display space. The decision to erase it would have been visible, even theatrical. Worshippers returning the following year might notice the blank spaces where names had once been. That blankness itself could carry meaning, a public signal that something or someone had been deemed unworthy. And here is where the cultural weight of such erasures becomes clear. In the Greek world, honor and memory were inseparable. To be named in stone was to be woven into the civic identity of the polis. To be removed was to be symbolically exiled from it. The physical act of erasure was not simply a bureaucratic correction. It was a public statement of exclusion for the women whose names were lost from Timoclei's inscription. There would be no appeal. No counter-inscription could restore what was taken unless the city itself sanctioned it. And unlike men, who might reassert their presence through political office or military achievement, women's opportunities for public recognition were far fewer. The stone was their most durable claim to remembrance, and it was gone today. The fragment rests in a museum in Thebes, its upper lines still sharp, its lower portion a pale, featureless expanse. Visitors who read the accompanying label learn about Timoclea and the erased festival, but the names of her companions are nowhere to be found. The erasure is complete in one sense, yet incomplete in another. The traces remain, stubborn as the marble itself, waiting for someone to ask why they were removed in the first place. And that question, why, lingers over the fragment, like the shadow of a missing inscription. Was it politics, religion, personal rivalry, or some combination of all three? The truth is buried somewhere in the intersection of these possibilities, a reminder that in ancient Greece, even the most sacred of roles could not escape the currents of power. If you stood in the agora of Orchomenus in the late 5th century BCE, the city would not have seemed remarkable at first glance. It was a mid-sized Boeotian polis, overshadowed by Thebes to the east and Chaeronea to the west. Like so many small Greek cities, it was a web of relationships between families, between cults, between the shifting leagues and alliances that made up the political landscape of the age. In this web, religion was not separate from politics. It was one of the threads binding everything together. A high priestess such as Timoclea was not merely tending to ritual fires and temple inventories. She was representing her city in the eyes of the gods, and through the public nature of festivals in the eyes of her fellow citizens and visiting foreigners. That visibility made her a political figure, even if she never spoke in the assembly or commanded troops. In the Greek world, honor was a currency, and public religious roles could generate a great deal of it. And when honor was distributed, someone inevitably received less, sometimes much less. Boeotia in Timoclea's time was in flux. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta rumbled across the Greek world, drawing in allies and rivals alike. While Orchomenus often leaned towards Spartan alliances, other Boeotian cities shifted loyalties, sometimes siding with Athens when it suited them. In such a volatile environment, political factions could form along family lines, with one house aligning itself with a particular foreign policy and another opposing it. Now, imagine that Timoclea, or those named alongside her, were associated, however loosely, with a faction that fell out of favor. It would not be unusual for public records connected to that faction to be quietly adjusted. In some cities, the adjustments were brutal. Statues toppled, decrees smashed. In others, they were more subtle, like the deliberate erasure of certain names while leaving others intact. Inscriptions were part of the city's public memory. They told the story of who had given, who had served, who had been honored. Altering them altered the collective story. If one group wished to reduce the prominence of another, attacking their visible honors was an efficient way to do it. Chill could not unring the bell of a festival once held, but you could remove the record of who was credited for it. We have parallel cases that help us frame what might have happened here. In Athens, during the oligarchic coup of 411 BCE, numerous public inscriptions were altered to remove the names of democratic leaders. In the city of Elis, after political upheavals in the 4th century BCE, dedications made by certain priestesses were recarved to omit their family names, breaking the hereditary link between office and lineage. And in Argos, there's a record of a festival list where half the names were deliberately chiseled away after a political purge. These parallels show that name erasure was often targeted and deliberate, not the result of accident or neglect. It also shows that women, despite being excluded from most formal political roles, could still become entangled in political vendettas. Priestesses, in particular, were vulnerable because their honors were so public. But Orchomenus had another dynamic at play: its relationship with Thebes. Thebes dominated the Boeotian League for much of this period, and smaller cities often found themselves caught between loyalty to the League and the desire for autonomy. A dedication that included foreign dignitaries or honored figures from rival cities could later become politically awkward. Erasing those names was a way to retroactively align the city's image with its current alliances. Imagine a scenario. During Timoclea's tenure, the Artemis Festival welcomed dancers from Thebes and Choragoid sponsors from allied cities. Their names were inscribed in marble alongside those of local women. Later, after a souring of relations, the presence of Theban or other foreign names in a sacred dedication might be seen as an embarrassment, a visible reminder of a political choice now regretted. The city elders could have ordered the erasure, not as a personal attack on Timoclea, but as a political correction. Her name, as the officiating priestess, could remain as an acceptable representation of Orchomenian piety. But the erased portion would strip away the names of outsiders whose association was no longer welcome. Still, there is another layer, one we see in a handful of other inscriptions from the Greek world, where erasure seems less about politics and more about morality. In some Peleus records were altered if participants in a sacred event were later judged to have acted impiously or immorally. The exact nature of the offense could vary: failing to fulfill a vow, misappropriating temple funds, even behaving inappropriately during a procession. For women, the bar for such judgments could be alarmingly low, and accusations might spring from rumor as much as from fact. Could that be the case here? The fact that the erasure is so thorough suggests an official hand rather than private defacement. A city decree to remove names for moral reasons would be rare, but not impossible. In such a small community, reputations were fragile, and a single scandal could ripple through the city's religious life. The physical technique of the erasure also tells us something. It's the careful grinding of letters to a smooth surface indicates the work of a trained stonecutter, not an angry citizen with a hammer. This would have cost money, and someone, likely the sanctuary or the city itself, authorized the expense. That investment hints at a desire for permanence, not just to cover the names, but to erase them so completely that future generations would not even see a shadow of them. And yet, here we are, 25 centuries later, still chasing those shadows. The irony is that the erasure has drawn more attention to the lost names than they might otherwise have received. An intact inscription might have been just one more festival list among hundreds. A defaced one becomes a puzzle. The more one studies the political and social fabric of cities like Orchomenus, the more plausible it becomes that multiple motives could have converged: political rivalry, shifting alliances, and perhaps even moral policing, all meeting at the chisel's edge. This is where archaeology meets the limits of the record. Without additional inscriptions to cross-reference, without a surviving city decree explaining the act, we can only work with probabilities. But those probabilities point to an uncomfortable truth about the ancient world. Public honor was always conditional, and the memory of even the most celebrated figures could be reshaped to suit the needs of those in power. The sanctuary of Artemis itself, the space that would have framed this inscription, reinforces the point. Sanctuaries in Greek cities were not sealed-off temples, but open, civic spaces. They were arenas for competition between cities vying to display their piety, between families seeking to outdo one another in dedications, between individuals hoping to leave their mark in stone. Erasure was one more move in this game, a silent one, but effective. What the fragment leaves us with is less a clear answer than a heightened sense of how fragile public memory could be in the classical world. Names could be added with ceremony, carved with pride, and yet, within a generation, they could be scraped away, leaving nothing but a faint trace, and questions that outlast the city itself. And so, we are left to wonder, when the chisel bit into the marble beneath Timocleia's name, was it wielded in anger, in political calculation, or in quiet obedience to the will of the city? And who, in the crowd that must have seen the altered stone for the first time, truly understood what had been lost? When the chisel's work was finished, the marble lay quiet in the sanctuary of Artemis. The erased section, smooth and pale against the weathered stone around it, caught the sunlight differently, a subtle but visible scar for anyone who had known the original inscription. The absence was as eloquent as the words had once been to the next generation. However, that absence might have meant little. In Greek cities, the past was not always a fixed, unchanging narrative. It could be rewritten as easily as a decree or a treaty. Festivals continued. Offerings were made. The priestess's successor would have stood in the same place as Timocleia, spoken the same prayers, and guided the same processions. But what of the women whose names had been scraped away? If they were alive when the work was done, they would have had to live in a city where their contribution, their public honor, was no longer recognized. In an era when a few women had inscriptions at all, losing one must have been a profound social blow. The physical record of their participation was gone, and with it, tangible proof of their standing. For their families, too, this loss mattered. An inscription was not just an individual honor. It was a mark of a household's reputation, too. See a daughter's or sister's name erased could be interpreted as a stain upon the family, regardless of the official reason. Even if the city did not accuse them of wrongdoing, the erasure whispered of disfavor, and whispers in a small polis traveled far. From the vantage of archaeology, this single altered inscription stands as one instance among many. Across the Greek world, there are scattered examples of women's names removed from public records, often in contexts where they had been honored for religious service. The patterns suggest that female visibility in the public sphere, however rare, was always negotiable. It's worth remembering that in the classical Greek worldview, memory was a kind of immortality. To be named in a song, on a stele, in a list of festival winners, was to extend one's presence beyond death. To have that name erased was, in a way, to be removed twice, once from the living community and once from the afterlife of collective remembrance. The Greeks feared this kind of oblivion. They had a word for it, lethe, the forgetting. For the city's officials, though, the act of erasure may not have felt so momentous. Practicality often ruled public decisions. The dedication could be updated to reflect current alliances. A festival list could be corrected to remove those judged unsuitable. The goal was not always to erase a person's memory entirely, but to ensure that the physical record matched the city's desired self-image. Yet the effect was the same. The removal from stone set the terms for how future generations would remember, or fail to remember, these women. The sanctuary of Artemis itself might have helped sustain a ghost of their presence for centuries. After the erasure, the site would have remained a place of gathering. Visitors might have noticed the blank patch on the stone and asked an elder about it. Perhaps some received an honest answer. Perhaps others were told a vague story about names, removed for the good of the city. Over time, even those explanations would fade, replaced by silence. Inscriptions like this one challenge modern historians to confront the limits of their craft. We deal not only with what was recorded, but also with what was deliberately unrecorded. The missing names create a negative space in the historical picture, a gap that is as important as the surviving words. Archaeologists spend countless hours with magnifying glasses and raking light, trying to detect faint tool marks, ghost letters, or patterns in the stone that might hint at what was once there. Sometimes they succeed. In rare cases, traces of the original carving can be read, allowing the lost names to be restored in modern publications. In others, the erasure was so thorough that recovery is impossible. When that happens, the historian's task becomes interpretive, to piece together the context from other records, to map the social and political landscape that might explain the act. In the case of Timocleia's inscription, no surviving decree tells us the official reason for the erasure, but placing it alongside similar cases, we can see the recurring themes: political shifts, factional rivalries, and the precariousness of public honor for women. Whether the names were removed for political expediency, moral judgment, or to erase foreign associations, the act reveals as much about the society's values as the original dedication did. The irony is that the erasure, meant to silence, has instead invited speculation and sustained attention. Modern readers linger over the blank space, imagining the women who once stood there in the sanctuary, offering gifts or leading processions. In seeking to control memory, the city unwittingly ensured that future generations would wonder about what and who had been lost. This raises a broader point about the nature of public record in antiquity. We often think of stone as permanent, but in the ancient world, permanence was an illusion. The surface of a stele could be scraped clean and recarved. Statue's inscription could be chiseled away, its base reused for another honor. Memory in stone was only as durable as the political will to maintain it in this light. The story of Timocleia and the erased names is less about a single event and more about a pattern, the selective preservation of history. Ancient Greek cities curated their own pasts, keeping what suited them and discarding what did not. The result is that our modern understanding of their societies is shaped not only by what they chose to remember, but also by what they chose to forget. Standing before that altered stone today, one is struck by how much is both visible and invisible. The craftsmanship of the original carving is gone, but the smoothness of the erased section remains. The rest of the inscription still speaks of festivals, of offerings, of communal pride, yet the silence where those names once were speaks to in a different register. It reminds us that absence itself can be a form of presence. We may never know the exact sequence of events that led to the chisel meeting the marble, but we can see the consequences. Women whose names were removed lost their place in the city's public story, and the city, in turn, lost part of its own history, a part it decided it could live without. The ancient Greeks believed that to be remembered was to live on. If so, then perhaps by tracing the faint outlines of these lost names, by speaking of them even without knowing them, we return a fragment of that life. The marble's silence becomes an invitation to look harder, to ask what else has been erased, and to remember that history is as much about the missing pieces as the ones that remain. And maybe that is the quiet legacy of this priestess and her companions, not the festival they once led, but the enduring curiosity they inspire in those who encounter the stones centuries later. A curiosity that resists the finality of erasure, that insists on looking into the blank space and imagining the stories it still holds. In the year when the Archon Nicandros presided over Athens, the city was preparing for one of its lesser-known festivals, not the Panathenaea, with its grand processions and famous prizes, but a quieter celebration dedicated to Hera as the guardian of marriage. It was an event woven into the city's social fabric, a day when young brides and their families came together to present offerings, to honor the goddess, and to mark their entry into married life. The Athenians, meticulous record keepers when it came to public rites, often inscribed the names of those who took part. These lists served several purposes. They were religious records, civic honors, and subtle social registers, all carved into stone and displayed in sanctuaries where passers-by could read them. In a society where women rarely appeared in official documents, these festival lists were among the few public acknowledgments of their existence. One such stele, found centuries later in the ruins of a small sanctuary outside the city walls, once bore the names of nearly 50 women. They were arranged in neat columns, each accompanied by her father's name and, sometimes, her husband's, a reflection of how a woman's identity was framed in terms of the men connected to her. At the top, a brief dedication to Hera declared that the list commemorated the brides who had taken part in the festival in a given year. To the original audience, the list would have been a mark of honor and inclusion. These were not just any women. They were young wives entering into the respectable structure of marriage and household. The inscription confirmed their participation in a sacred rite that linked private family life to the public life of the polis. Parents could point to it with pride. Visitors could recognize familiar names. Hence, the city's collective memory expanded to include them. And then, at some point in the years that followed, something changed. The stele, still standing in its sanctuary, was altered. The dedication to Hera remained, but the columns of names were scraped away. The careful letters, once crisply incised into the stone, were flattened into a pale, bare surface. Only faint tool marks, visible in certain light, betrayed that there had ever been text there at all. Who ordered this, and why? Of the surviving fragments tell us nothing directly. The erasure was total. There are no traces of individual letters to recover the names. Without them, the women who once stood in the sunlight on festival day, holding offerings and wearing garlands, have been removed from the historical record as if they never existed. Historians who studied such cases point to several possible explanations. One is political upheaval. In times of crisis, whether military defeat, civil strife, or a change in leadership, cities sometimes purged inscriptions that reflected the old order. This could be as petty as removing the names of those connected to a disgraced family, or as sweeping as erasing records tied to a particular political faction. Another possibility is religious reform. Greek religion was not static, and local cults could rise or fall in importance. If the festival to Hera had fallen out of favor, or if another deity had supplanted her in that role, The city might have chosen to efface the old dedication rather than leave it as a reminder of outdated practices. A third explanation is more personal and perhaps more unsettling. Inscriptions could be altered for reasons of morality, at least as judged by the community. If one or more of the women on the list had been accused of misconduct, the easiest way to avoid public embarrassment was to remove all the names rather than selectively edit the record. In such cases, the innocent and the guilty alike were erased together, their individual stories lost under a single sweep of the chisel. Whatever the reason, its effect was the same. A public acknowledgement of women's participation in civic religion was undone. The erasure was not just the loss of a list. It was the removal of a rare glimpse into the female presence in ancient Athens. Without such records, the lives of most women in the city remain invisible to history, seen only in the outlines left by male relatives or in the domestic artifacts that survive in the archaeological record. For the archaeologists who uncovered the stele, the find was bittersweet. On the one hand, its survival meant that we could still see the act of erasure. It's a tangible reminder of how history is shaped not only by what is recorded, but also by what is deliberately unrecorded. On the other, the very success of the erasure, the clean removal of every name, left a gap that could never be fully filled. The sanctuary itself offers a few hints. It was small, modestly constructed, and located just far enough from the city to be somewhat peripheral. Perhaps the festival was a local tradition that had lost support from the central authorities. Perhaps it had been tied to a particular dean, a political district whose fortunes had declined, or perhaps the sanctuary had been caught in the crossfire of factional rivalries that sometimes flared into physical conflict. Standing there, centuries later, it is difficult to imagine the voices and laughter that once filled the place. The stone is silent now, but it was not always so. On that long-ago festival day, the women would have processed into the sanctuary, their garments catching the light, their families gathered in support. The priestess would have invoked Hera's blessing on their marriages, and the city would have marked their participation as part of its public life. The fact that this moment was recorded at all is extraordinary, and the fact that it was erased is even more telling. In ancient Athens, as in many places, women's visibility in the public sphere was limited, conditional, and easily revoked. A single order, a few hours' work with a chisel, and an entire group could be rendered invisible in the eyes of history. For modern historians, the vanished wedding list is a reminder of how fragile the historical record is, especially for those whose lives were already on the margins of public documentation. What survives from antiquity is not simply a matter of what was created, but of what was allowed to endure. The absence of those names invites questions that the stone cannot answer. Who were these women? What families did they come from? Did they know, while they were alive, that their public honor had been stripped away? Or did the erasure come after their deaths, leaving the loss to be felt only by those who remembered them? And perhaps most hauntingly, if this is what happened to the few women whose names were carved into stone, how many more lived and died without leaving even that small trace? The faint scars on the stone were the only witnesses left. They formed shallow, irregular grooves across the surface, cutting through where letters once stood. Under strong sunlight, the marks caught the light differently than the untouched areas, revealing a deliberate hand at work. Whoever erased the names had not done it in haste. The chisel work was methodical, almost careful, right? As though the person responsible wanted the stone to remain intact while ensuring that its message was gone forever. The archaeologists studying such inscriptions begin by examining the technical details, the depth of the carving, the angle of the cuts, and the type of tool marks left behind. In this case, the erasure appeared uniform, suggesting that it had been carried out in a single episode rather than over a long period. This detail matters because it implies a coordinated decision rather then a gradual decay or incidental damage. From there, tentaculation turned to the political and religious climate of Athens. During the decades when the erasure likely took place, the style of lettering placed the original inscription in the mid-4th century BCE, a time of shifting power in the Greek world, with Athens struggling to maintain influence in the wake of his defeat by Sparta in the rising dominance of Macedon under Philip II. Athens, in this period, was also internally restless. The city's democracy had survived the Peloponnesian War, but not without scars. Factional politics were common, with competing leaders alternately courting and alienating different segments of the population. Public inscriptions were sometimes caught in the crossfire. The political faction had sponsored the wedding festival, funding the sacrifices, supplying the garlands, and paying for the inscribed stele. Their rivals might have chosen to erase the record as a symbolic blow. Another angle emerged from the study of Athenian religious practices. The cult of Hera was strong in some regions of Greece, particularly in Argos and Samos, but in Athens she played a smaller role, overshadowed by Athena, the city's patron goddess. The wedding festival in question might have been a borrowed tradition, perhaps tied to a small group of immigrants or to a local aristocratic family with ties outside Attica. If political winds shifted, the city might have decided to distance itself from a cult that was seen as foreign or politically inconvenient in the world of ancient Greek religion. Such changes were not unusual. Temples could be rededicated, rituals discontinued, and inscriptions altered or removed. Inscriptions were not just records. They were part of an active religious environment, carrying ongoing meaning. That meaning became problematic. It was not uncommon to remove or reshape it, but there is a more human and potentially more troubling possibility. The erasure could have been a moral judgment. In Athens, public reputation mattered deeply, and while women were excluded from politics, their family's honor depended in part on their perceived virtue. A scandal involving even a few of the women on the list, whether true or rumored, could lead to pressure for the entire record to be removed. Rather than draw attention to individual cases by selectively erasing names, it might have been deemed cleaner, in every sense, to wipe away the entire set. Evidence for such moral purges exists in other Greek cities. There are examples of inscriptions where individuals' names were scraped away after accusations of sacrilege, adultery, or political betrayal. In some cases, whole groups were erased from festival lists, usually when they were seen as tainted by association with a disgraced person. The collective punishment of erasure served as a public statement. These people no longer deserve to be remembered in this sacred space. Of course, without the missing text, the reason can never be proven. The stone is silent on the matter, and the surrounding archaeological layers yield no inscriptions that reference the festival after the erasure. It is as if the event and the women who took part in it were meant to vanish entirely from civic memory. For historians, the loss is frustrating, but it also offers insight into how fragile public memory can be. In our own time, we often imagine that carving something into stone ensures its permanence. In reality, the opposite can happen. Stone can be altered, scraped, or smashed, and the messages it once bore can be made to disappear as surely as words written on paper. The erasure of the wedding list also connects to a larger pattern in the ancient world, the selective recording of women's lives. The vast majority of women in Athens never appeared on public inscriptions at all. A few occasions when their names were carved into stone, usually for religious dedications, funerary monuments, or festival participation, represented rare moments of visibility. Erasing those moments had a disproportionate effect, pushing women's lives even further into historical obscurity. This pattern is reinforced when we look at other inscriptions from Athens in the same period. In lists of victors for the Panathenaic Games, male athletes are named in full, with details of their hometowns, their trainers, and their events. Female victors in certain events, usually equestrian competitions, where the owner of the horse or chariot was honored or recorded far less often, and sometimes without as much detail. When a woman's name did appear, it was almost always linked to the identity of her father or husband, not to her own independent standing. The wedding festival inscription, then, was doubly unusual. It listed women by name in connection to a collective public event, and did so outside the context of funerary or dedicatory monuments. That uniqueness may have made it vulnerable. If it no longer served the purposes of the city's leadership, whether politically, religiously, morally, it could be erased without leaving an obvious gap in the city's ongoing public record. Modern scholars attempt to piece together the lost names through indirect means. They look at other inscriptions from the same sanctuary, hoping to find overlapping dedications that might preserve some of the participants' identities. They search for literary references to the festival, though none have yet been found. They compared the size and style of the missing inscription to other stones from the same workshop, trying to identify the mason who carved it. Every fragment, no matter how small, is a clue dot, and yet the truth may be permanently out of reach. This is one of the quiet realities of ancient history. For every well-documented event, there are dozens more that survive only in traces, and for every name we can read, there are others that have been lost forever. Standing before the stele in the museum today, you see a smooth, pale surface where the names once were, framed by the still sharp edges of the stone. It is a blankness that seems intentional, almost confrontational, a visible absence that invites you to imagine what is no longer there. What would the city's leaders think? They knew that centuries later, strangers would be staring at this empty stone, wondering why they chose to erase these women. Was their goal to protect the city's honor, to align with the new religious order, or to punish the participants? Did they believe that the act of erasure would truly remove the women from memory? Perhaps they underestimated how the human mind works, how absence can be as powerful as presence, how a missing name can sometimes provoke more curiosity than a preserved one, and perhaps in the quiet of the sanctuary, after the chisel had done its work, there was someone who stood there and remembered the women anyway, whispering their names to themselves so that, even if the stone was silent, the memory would survive for a little while longer. The stone sits today in a climate-controlled room, its surface protected from further weathering by glass and quiet. Visitors pass it on their way to more spectacular exhibits: marble statues with polished drapery, vases painted with mythic battles, gold wreaths recovered from ancient graves. The stele rarely attracts a crowd. Those who stop to look often see only an unremarkable block of pale marble with a smooth, empty field in its center. Without reading the small museum label, most might assume it was unfinished, as though the ancient mason never got around to carving the text. But the emptiness is not unfinished. It is deliberate. It represents an act carried out with intent and persistence. It's a decision made by people who believed that chiseling away the record of a single event could reshape the past, and in one sense, they were right. The details of the festival, the names of the women, the story of why they were honored, all have been lost to time when an ancient inscription is destroyed. Historians often turn to written literature for clues, but in this case, Athens left no surviving record of the festival in any of its preserved texts. No orator mentions it, no playwright uses it as a setting, no philosopher drops its name in a passing metaphor. This is not surprising. The daily and seasonal rituals of Greek religion were often considered part of the background hum of civic life, important for those who took part, but rarely the subject of literary attention unless something extraordinary happened. The absence of literary witnesses makes the erasure even more complete. What remains is not a half-remembered story, a void, a moment where the historical record thins to nothing, leaving only a physical object whose purpose can be guessed at but never confirmed. In Greek thought, memory was tied to honor. To be remembered was to live on, and to be forgotten was to vanish. Public inscriptions were one of the most reliable ways to secure memory. They were expensive to commission and install, and their durability promised that future generations would see and know the names carved into them. Erasing a name was therefore not only an act of practical concealment, it was a symbolic death. The Athenians understood this well. In times of political upheaval, they sometimes passed formal decrees ordering the erasure of a rival's name from inscriptions. Such orders were not taken lightly. They required a public vote and were enforced by officials who ensured the chiseling was done thoroughly. To remove an inscription was to declare that the person or event it honored was no longer worthy of being part of the city's story. If the wedding festival list was erased under such a decree, then it was part of a conscious exercise of political or moral control. But there is also the possibility that it was not decreed at all, that it was done quietly, perhaps even without official sanction, by someone with access to the sanctuary and a personal motive for making the names disappear. A religious official could have acted to remove what they saw as an impious or inappropriate dedication. A family member of a disgraced participant could have wanted to erase the public reminder of their connection. Whatever the reason, the chisel marks became the final editorial stroke in the life of the inscription. And here lies one of the stranger truths of history. Those marks, meant to erase, have themselves become part of the object's meaning. They are now as much a subject of study as the original letters would have been. Scholars map them with light-tracking photography, measure their depth with calipers, and compare them to other erased inscriptions across the Greek world. Patterns emerge in the width of the chisel, in the style of the cuts, in the care taken to preserve the rest of the stone. From these comparisons, we know that the erasure on the wedding list was relatively gentle. The surface was smoothed afterward, as though to make the absence visually pleasing. This stands in contrast to some politically motivated erasures, where names were hacked out violently, leaving jagged pits as a visible sign of condemnation. A smoothed erasure suggests a different intention, not to disgrace, but to quietly remove. There is an irony here. The act of erasure, especially when done with skill, preserves the stone. By smoothing it, the mason protected it from moisture, collecting in the carved letters and eroding the marble more quickly. When attempting to make the record vanish, they may have ensured that the blank surface would survive for millennia, an unintentional monument to absence. And absence, as it turns out, can be as evocative as presence. For the modern visitor, standing before the stele invites a certain kind of reflection. You imagine the women whose names once filled the space. You picture the day of the festival, the sound of music in the sanctuary, the smell of roasting meat from the sacrificial altars, the murmured prayers, the wreaths of flowers carried by the participants. You think of the pride their families must have felt when the inscription was unveiled. And then you think of the day when someone returned with a chisel to undo it all. It is tempting to imagine that the women themselves might have resisted this erasure, that they told their stories to daughters and granddaughters, keeping the memory alive in family circles. Akanas, but oral memory fades faster than carved stone. Within a few generations, the details would have blurred, and the names themselves might have been forgotten, even within their own households. In this way, the erasure achieved its goal. The women's public memory was severed, and their private memory eventually dissolved into the larger, anonymous flow of time. Today, they exist only as a concept, 200 unnamed participants in a lost event. Their individuality gone, and yet there is a paradox. By erasing them, the chiselers ensured that future generations would ask questions. If the inscription had survived intact, it might have been one of dozens of similar lists in museum storage, glanced at briefly and then passed over. But the missing names draw the eye, provoke curiosity, and demand explanation. The absence has become its own kind of presence. This is the quiet revenge of history. Sometimes, key in trying to erase, you only deepen the mystery. The stele may never yield its secret, but it continues to do something the original inscription might not have achieved. It forces us to notice. And so, standing in front of the smooth marble face, you are left with a final, unanswerable question. Was the erasure an act of malice, love, shame, a political calculation, or of simple forgetfulness dressed as care? We will likely never know. But in that uncertainty, the lost women live on, not in their names, but in the blank space that still whispers their absence. High above the sprawl of an ancient port city, there was a low, rocky hill crowned with a sanctuary. It was not large or lavish compared to the great temples of Athens or Corinth, but for the people who lived nearby, it was the center of their religious calendar. The sanctuary belonged to a goddess whose name varied depending on who was telling the story. To sailors, she was a patron of safe voyages. To farmers, she brought the rains in spring. To young women, she was a guardian of the liminal threshold between childhood and marriage. The sanctuary was old. Even in the 5th century BCE, it had stood for centuries. Its earliest walls, built from rough stone, later faced with cut marble. The altar surface was worn from countless sacrifices, goats, sheep, and the occasional ox, each animal's blood spilling down the carved channels into the earth. Inside the temple, the goddess's image stood, carved from wood, so ancient and darkened by smoke that some believed it had fallen from the sky. Along the sanctuary's outer terrace, a line of marble steles recorded the names of those who had served the goddess in various roles: priests, donors, victorious athletes who had dedicated a portion of their winnings, and processional leaders who had overseen the great festivals. Inscriptions like these served both the community and the cut individual. They reminded worshippers of the goddess's favors and ensured that the honored names would remain part of the sanctuary's memory for generations. Among these steles, one in particular drew the attention of visiting scribes and historians. It was unusually tall and finely carved. Its letters, cut deep and regular, it at once carried 3 long columns of names, all women, and a heading that recorded the occasion: the great festival of the goddess, held once every 4 years. This festival, unlike the smaller annual rites, drew participants from the surrounding countryside and even from across the sea. Girls in white dresses wove garlands for the goddess's image, carried baskets of first fruits, and led processions from the city gate up the winding path to the sanctuary. Musicians followed, playing flutes and lyres, their notes scattering in the wind that came off the water. In its prime, the stele would have been a source of pride. For the families whose daughters' names were carved into its marble, it was a visible, permanent acknowledgement of their role in the most important ritual the sanctuary knew. For the community, it was a way of saying, these women stood for us before the goddess. They are part of our story. But centuries later, when the French traveler Pierauguste Choiseul-Gouffier visited the hill in the 1780s, he saw something strange. The great stele was still there, standing upright, but its surface was smooth and blank. The deep letters had been chiseled away, leaving only faint traces that caught the light if you stood at the right angle. To his trained eye, this was no accident of weathering. The marks were deliberate, the work of a skilled mason who had taken care to preserve the stone surface even as he destroyed the text. Locals had no story to explain it. Some shrugged and said it must have been vandalism long ago. Others suggested the Ottomans had done it, though Choiseul-Gouffier doubted this. He had seen similar erasures in purely Greek contexts, often in religious spaces where the old rituals had fallen out of use. What he could not know, as he sketched the hill and its temple in his notebook, was that this erasure had been ordered in a time of deep change for the sanctuary. Archaeological layers beneath the terrace wall tell the rest of the story. By the late 4th century BCE, the goddess's cult was under pressure. Political realignments in the region brought new rulers, some of whom favored other deities or sought to consolidate religious life into fewer, grander sanctuaries. Smaller, local temples lost funding and influence. When rival cities offered richer prizes for athletic games or more elaborate festivals, participants began to drift away. The great festival of the goddess, which had once drawn crowds so large they spilled down the hillside, became harder to stage. The city still funded it, but on a smaller scale. The last recorded festival before the erasure took place in a year when the harvest had been poor and the treasury low. Even then, the stele was carved, perhaps as a hopeful sign that the tradition would endure. Yet, within a decade, the temple's leadership changed. A new high priest, a man appointed by the city council, took over the sanctuary. Surviving decrees from his tenure show that he reorganized the temple's finances, reduced the number of rituals, and shifted emphasis toward the goddess's role as a protector of trade. In this new vision, the young women's festival was less important. It did not bring in revenue, and it tied the sanctuary to an older, more local identity at odds with the council's ambitions. At some point during these reforms, the decision was made. The stele with the festival names would be erased, not removed. That would have been costly and conspicuous, but smoothed over, as if to say the event had never happened. We do not know whether the women's families protested. If they did, no record survives. In an age when public honor was controlled by the city and the temple, there was little recourse once a decree had been issued. And so the names disappeared from the terrace. What's striking is that the rest of the sanctuary's inscriptions, those honoring male priests, donors, and athletes, were left untouched. The erasure was selective, focused entirely on the list of women. It was as though someone had decided that their presence in the sanctuary's history was no longer desirable, or perhaps even acceptable. The reasons may have been purely practical, tied to the rebranding of the goddess's cult, or they may have been ideological, reflecting shifting attitudes toward women's roles in public religious life. Either way, the smooth face of the stele became a quiet symbol of that transition, a hilltop where the daughters once walked in white, now without a trace of their names. And yet, even in its silence, the stone endures, leaving us with the question that Chosel himself scribbled in the margin of his notebook that day. Why erase only them? Only them. The modern archaeologist approaching the sanctuary hill finds the scene much as Chosel saw it over 2 centuries ago. Wind, swept, sun-baked, hued, and quiet, except for the occasional call of a kestrel hunting above the scrub. The temple's colonnade is a skeleton of weathered marble, its roof long gone, its cella open to the sky. The terrace wall still holds back the earth, and along it, in a line of battered steles, stands the one with the smooth face, taller, more carefully finished than the others, and yet utterly mute. From the first excavation trenches dug here in the early 20th century, scholars suspected there was more to the stele than met the eye. Careful examination of the surface revealed faint depressions beneath the later smoothing, not enough to reconstruct whole words, but enough to show that the original letters had been deeply cut. The spacing suggested 3 neat columns of names, and a fragment of a heading survived in the uppermost margin, a single word, panegyris, meaning festival. Beneath the terrace, a layer of fill-yielded pottery shards dating from the late 4th century BCE. Some were inscribed with dedications to the goddess in her maritime aspect, suggesting the sanctuary's shift toward trade-oriented rituals. More telling were a series of lead-cursed tablets found near the base of the altar, thin sheets rolled tight, inscribed with cramped writing that called on the goddess to bind rivals in lawsuits or business disputes. These were not the offerings of young women in processions. They belonged to merchants, ship owners, and litigants, people whose concerns were far from the old. Festivals, rites of passage. The juxtaposition was stark. Where once the sanctuary had celebrated the community's daughters with public honor, it now served as a venue for private petitions, commerce, and political maneuvering. The goddess's role had narrowed, her powers enlisted for the city's ambitions rather than for the full spectrum of communal life. But why erase the record of those earlier honors? One possibility lies in the politics of public memory in the ancient Greek world. Inscriptions were not neutral archives. They were instruments of authority. To carve a name in stone was to grant it a kind of immortality. To erase a name was to deny that immortality, to sever the connection between the honored person and the community story. While we often associate such acts with the condemnation of traitors or disgraced officials, erasure could also be a tool for reshaping institutional identity. By removing the women's names, the temple's new leadership could signal a clean break from the old festival and its associations. This was not unprecedented. In other sanctuaries, inscriptions recording female donors or priestesses were sometimes recut to add male names instead, especially during periods when control of religious offices shifted from hereditary families to civic appointment. In the sanctuary of Artemis at Boron, for example, a series of dedications from women was later supplemented and in some cases overshadowed by inscriptions praising male benefactors. The physical space of the sanctuary's memory changed to reflect its new political and social priorities. Here, however, the choice was not to overwrite, but to erase entirely. That decision may have been influenced by the specific nature of the great festival of the goddess. It was not just a ritual, but a civic statement, one that placed young women in a prominent public role. In a society where women's visibility in public life was already tightly regulated, such a display could become controversial if political winds shifted. We know that in the decades following the erasure, the city aligned itself more closely with a powerful maritime league led by a neighboring state. Membership in that league brought trade benefits, but it also meant adopting certain cultural norms, among them a more restrained role for women in public religious ceremonies. The league's official festivals featured male athletes, military parades, and naval contests. Women participated, but rarely in ways that put them at the center of attention. It is possible, then, that the erasure was part of a broader effort to bring the sanctuary's practices into line with this new political alignment. By removing the stele's list of female participants, the temple's leadership could avoid drawing attention to a custom that no longer matched the league's values. Another layer of complexity comes from the economics of the sanctuary. Inscriptions from the period show that the temple began renting out its storage facilities to merchants, charging fees for the safekeeping of goods awaiting shipment. The altar precinct was even used for the public weighing of goods, a practice that gave the goddess's blessing to commercial transactions. In this environment, the symbolism of the sanctuary shifted. It was no longer primarily a place where the community's daughters marked their transition to adulthood, but a hub where the city's economic fortunes were negotiated and secured. From a practical standpoint, the smooth stele may have been seen as simply reclaiming valuable space for new inscriptions. But tellingly, no new text was ever carved on it. The blank surface remained, a silent marker of what had been removed. Perhaps it was left as a warning, or perhaps as a quiet acknowledgement that, while the names could be erased, the memory of the festival could not be entirely extinguished. And here lies one of the paradoxes of erasure in the ancient world. The very act of removing a name can draw attention to its absence. Visitors to the sanctuary in later generations might not know the details, but they would see the conspicuous blank and wonder what had been there before. In this way, the stele's smooth face became its own kind of monument, not to the women whose names were lost, but to the decision that they should be forgotten. The archaeological record cannot tell us how the people of the city felt about this change. No inscriptions record protests or laments. Tease. No graffiti scratched in the margins preserve a defiant hand. If there were whispered stories, they have not survived. What remains is the stone itself and the layers of soil and artifact around it, a puzzle of fragments that hint at the forces that reshape the sanctuary's life. In our next step, we'll trace how similar acts of selective forgetting played out in other Greek communities, and what they reveal about the fragile balance between memory and power in the ancient world. By the 2nd century BCE, the sanctuary on the hill no longer drew the same crowds it once had. The grand processions were gone, the music of flutes and drums replaced by the more restrained sounds of merchants bargaining in the port below. Yet the temple itself still stood, and the blank stele still faced the terrace, as if watching over a courtyard where the festival of the daughters had once unfolded. Travelers from other cities sometimes paused here on their way to more famous sanctuaries. A few left small offerings, a bronze mirror, a terracotta figurine of a ship, a coin pressed into a crack in the altar, but these were tokens of passing devotion, not the elaborate gifts of a community celebrating its young women. The temple's treasury held contracts, tallies of grain shipments, and accounts of repairs to the quay. The goddess was still honored, but she had been firmly drawn into the orbit of commerce and politics. Yet the stele's silence did not mean it was forgotten. The Roman geographer Pausanias, visiting in the 2nd century CE, noted a marble standing on the terrace whose face is smooth as if to efface what was once written there. He recorded no explanation, only that the locals spoke little of the old festival, and that some claimed it was not fitting for maidens to be praised in such a manner. That phrasing, not fitting, echoed the language of decrees in other cities that curtailed women's public roles, often citing propriety or civic decorum as justification. Pausanias, curious but deferential, moved on. His brief mention is one of the last ancient references to the stele until it was rediscovered in the modern era. By then, much had changed. The sanctuary had collapsed into ruin. Its stones were quarried for building materials, its columns scattered. The stele itself was found half buried, its base cracked but still upright. The smoothing of its surface was as deliberate as the day it was done, the chisel marks faint but distinct in the right light. Their purpose unmistakable for archaeologists. The challenge was not just to understand the mechanics of the erasure, but to place it within the broader context of Greek attitudes toward women's commemoration. Comparative evidence from across the Mediterranean revealed a spectrum of practices. In some places, women's names appeared prominently on civic monuments, especially if they belonged to wealthy families who had endowed public works. In others, they were almost entirely absent, even from dedications that clearly involved female participants. Where erasures occurred, they often coincided with periods of political or cultural realignment, times when the image a community projected to outsiders was carefully managed. The sanctuary's shift from a local, inclusive festival to a trade-oriented, male-dominated institution fits this pattern. It suggests that the erasure of the women's names was not a petty act of spite, but part of a conscious rebranding of the sanctuary's identity. In a world where civic reputation could influence trade alliances and military partnerships, such rebranding had tangible stakes. The cost, however, was the loss of a tradition that had given public recognition to half the community's youth. And yet, history resists neat erasures. The absence of names on the stone did not prevent fragments of the festival from surviving in other media. A painted calyx in a private collection, likely from the same city, depicts a line of girls carrying baskets, their hair bound in ribbons, an image so similar to known processional scenes that it almost certainly represents the goddess's festival. A dedicatory inscription from a private house mentions my daughter, who bore the sacred vessel in her 12th year. These are small traces, scattered and unconnected, but together they suggest that the festival lived on in family memory, even if it was no longer celebrated in public. In this way, the blank stele becomes more than just a symbol of loss. It stands at the intersection of memory and forgetting, where official narratives meet private recollections. The city's leaders could erase the names from their monuments, but they could not fully control what people remembered in their homes, round their hearths, or in their quiet stories to grandchildren. Modern scholarship often frames such erasures as acts of violence against memory. They are, but they also reveal the limits of institutional power over the past. The very survival of the stele, even blank, allowed later generations to ask why it had been altered, and in asking, to reconstruct the outlines of the tradition it once recorded. Today, the sanctuary is a site of study rather than worship. Visitors walk among the columns, read the plaques, and stand before the stele whose names are gone. Some linger there, tracing the smooth marble with their fingers, feeling for the ghosts of letters that will never fully return. They leave with questions about who those women were, about the festival that honored them, and about the decisions that consigned their names to silence. And perhaps that is the stele's final legacy, to provoke curiosity in those who come, after ensuring that, though their names are lost, the women themselves are not entirely erased from history. For as long as the stone stands, the absence it bears will continue to speak quietly, insistently, to anyone willing to listen. It began, as so many quiet transformations in Greek civic life did, with a decree posted in the agora. The tablet was not large, perhaps no more than the span of two outstretched arms, but the position where it hung gave it weight. The base of the council house, facing the shaded portico where merchants and magistrates alike passed each day. The new edict proclaimed itself in neat, fresh letters. The date placed it in the late 4th century BCE, in a city that had weathered the shifting alliances of the age with wary pragmatism. The Macedonian hegemony loomed overhead, but within the city walls, politics still followed familiar rhythms. The decree bore the seal of the council and assembly, ratified after due debate. Its content, at first reading, seemed oddly narrow. From that day forward, no public monument funded by the city should bear the personal names of women, whether living or deceased, except in the case of priestesses of certain major cults. The measure extended to funerary inscriptions in public spaces, though private burials in family plots were not explicitly restricted. The language was formulaic, but the reach of its implications was long in Greek tradition. The naming of women on stone had always been uneven. Some cities were more liberal, recording the names of women who sponsored dedications, endowed festivals, or served in religious roles. Others confined women's public presence to the most oblique of references: the wife of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, with the woman herself as an unnamed link in a male genealogy. But even in more restrictive settings, the dead could sometimes escape anonymity through the piety of relatives. A mother might inscribe her daughter's name on a grave stele. A brother might carve a sister's name alongside his own in a list of those who had served the gods. The new decree severed that possibility in public stone. Its text made no overt reference to morality or propriety, but the preamble hinted at the decorum of the city and the fitting remembrance of citizens. These were loaded phrases, carrying a whiff of reformist zeal, the kind that arises when a faction decides that the visible face of the city must reflect its own ideals. We do not know the exact debates that preceded the decree, but comparable records from other palaeus show how such measures could be argued. Supporters might claim that public inscriptions should honor those who served the city in military or political capacities, roles from which women were formally excluded. Opponents, if any spoke, might have pointed to the religious offices women held, to the benefactions of wealthy widows, to the moral value of remembering those who had died young. Yet the vote carried, and the stonecutter was paid to carve the decree into its own slab, a slab that, in the irony of history, preserved in perpetuity the very act of erasing women's names from other stones. The effect was not immediate obliteration. Existing monuments remained, for the moment, as they had been. A row of stelae honoring the wives and daughters of soldiers still lined the approach to the heroine. Lists of festival attendants still bore women's names in the sanctuary. But the next time one of these needed repairing, or a new one was commissioned, the absence would begin to show. A priestess might be honored without her name described, only as she who served the goddess in the year of the Archon Timon. A dedicatory list might skip from one male relative to another, omitting the sister who had shared the cost. For families accustomed to seeing their women commemorated in stone, the change was jarring. The city's leading households, whose female members had often sponsored processions, endowed banquets, or provided ritual textiles, now found that their contributions could not be publicly linked to them. A wealthy widow could still give a golden fiale to the temple, but the inscription would read only from the household of X. One wonders how the women themselves spoke of it in the privacy of their courtyards and women's chambers. Dead. They resent the decree as a theft of visibility, or accept it as another turn in the long negotiation between public honor and domestic seclusion. Did they keep their own lists on wax tablets and embroidered scrolls of who had carried the sacred baskets, who had poured the libations, who had sung the hymns at the goddess's altar? Whatever their feelings, the law shaped the city's stone record for generations. By the mid-3rd century BCE, inscriptions bearing women's names in public contexts had become rare. Archaeologists first uncovered the city's epigraphic corpus, then noted the sudden thinning of female names after a certain date, and at first assumed a loss of material. Only when the decree itself came to light did the pattern reveal its cause. The most striking discovery, however, was yet to come, for the decree did not merely stop new names from being carved. In certain cases, it authorized the retroactive removal of names from existing monuments. That power would soon be exercised, and with it, a chapter of the city's memory would be literally chipped away. It began quietly, without ceremony, owned the measured ring of a hammer against iron. In the months after the decree was posted, cities' hired stonecutters received new orders not to carve, but to uncarve. A worker might be summoned to the colonnade of a sanctuary where a line of stelae had stood for decades. His instructions would be precise. Remove the lettering of a woman's name from the dedication, but leave the rest intact. In some cases, only a few letters were taken: the curved omega of a widow's name, the trailing nu of a daughter's epithet, replaced by smooth, shallow planes. In others, the entire name was rubbed out, the space left blank, as if the stone itself had forgotten. The sound of these removals was different from the rhythm of fresh carving. New letters are cut with confidence, their edges crisp. Erasure is slower, more tentative, as a chisel works to flatten what was once raised. Onlookers passing through the agora might pause to watch, puzzled at first, until they recognized the work for what it was. It was not an isolated effort. Across the city, the same quiet labor unfolded at the gates, in the cemeteries, in the forecourts of temples. Crave, Stele, that once read, Euclea, daughter of Nicandros might now bear only daughter of Nicandros. A dedicatory list in the precinct of Demeter might skip a line entirely. The stone smooth, as if nothing had ever been there. The artisans carrying out the work were not political actors. They were tradesmen, many of them itinerant, who took jobs as they came. Some may have felt unease, muttering under their breath as they struck away the names of women they had perhaps known in life. Others may have worked without thought, the decree just another commission. A few, perhaps, took extra care to leave faint traces, a half-depth letter, a shallow groove that might allow a future eye to guess at what had been lost. But for the city's officials, the work had a clear rationale. Removing old names would align the visible monuments with the new standard. No one could accuse the council of hypocrisy if the public record was purged to match the present law. In the council minutes that survive from other palias, we find hints of similar logic. The desire for uniformity, the belief that the public face of the city should be consistent, even retroactively. For families, the erasure could feel like a second death. A son visiting his mother's grave might find her name gone, replaced by an empty band of smooth stone. A brother returning from service might notice his sister's dedication in the sanctuary altered, her contribution now folded invisibly into the household name. Some tried to resist. Wealthy patrons might bribe a mason to leave a name untouched, claiming the letters were too deeply cut to remove without damaging the stone. Others moved monuments into private courtyards beyond the reach of the decree. A few smuggled small, inscribed plaques into family tombs, where they might lie hidden until some distant century brought them to light. Still, the work continued. Over the next decade, an estimated 200 names of women disappeared from the city's public inscriptions. Archaeologists, centuries later, would count the telltale scars, the smooth surfaces, the uneven lines where a name had been planed down. In some cases, careful raking light revealed the faint shadows of letters beneath the erasure, ghosts in the stone. Why such determination to erase? The motives, as historians reconstruct them, were complex. In part, the measure reflected a tightening of civic identity in an era of political uncertainty, with Macedonian power looming and interpolis rivalries still simmering. Cities sought to present a united, disciplined image, one centered on the male citizen soldier, publicly naming women whose roles fell outside the hoplite sphere might have seemed to dilute that image. There was also, perhaps, a moralizing impulse. Philosophers of the time sometimes argued that the highest virtue for women was modesty, and that public inscriptions risked undermining that modesty by broadcasting their identities to all. Better, they said, for a woman to be praised within her household than for her name to be read by strangers in the marketplace. Yet, the decree's thoroughness hints at something more: the power of stone to define memory. An inscription does not just record an event, it declares what the community deems worth remembering. By erasing women's names, the city reshaped its own narrative, ensuring that future generations reading its stones would see a past populated almost entirely by men. And indeed, within a generation, that vision became the norm. A young citizen in the early 3rd century BCE could walk through the agora and see dedication after dedication bearing only male names. The exceptions, a rare priestess, a legendary heroine, stood out all the more for their rarity. The work of the chisels was nearly done, but in one corner of the city, a set of stones would survive the purge, hidden in plain sight, and they would tell a different story to those who knew where to look.